Here in the War Room, we've already talked about the greatest snipers from different countries, but today is the day for you to meet the greatest Brazilian sniper. Can you believe we're on the 100th documentary here in the War Room? Look, I only started this project 2 years ago. Now, on the 2-year anniversary, we're reaching 100 documentaries on air. Today's episode is special. Stay tuned. But before we start, I want to show you this amazing gift I received from the artist Sergio Paulo Soni, a Reggiani RE 2005, Sagittario from the Aeronautics Network, 1943. This plane is my favorite from World War II. I already mentioned that in a live stream when you guys asked me. I'm very grateful to Sergio for this amazing gift, but don't worry, you won't be left empty-handed, because he also gave me this Nakajima Key 43 painting to give you since you're a War Room fan. To enter for a chance to win this amazing piece, it's very easy. You go to Facebook, like our page, and tag 3 friends in the post. That's it. You're already entered. The link to the post is right down here. So let's get to our story. Marco Antonio de Souza was born in the city of Rio de Janeiro on December the 21, 1964, the third of 9 children of Jorge de Souza and Ramira Leoncio de Souza. His father was caretaker at a CNAC unit in Copacabana, and the family lived in a small room there. His father, raised in the countryside, wanted to leave the city with his family. After buying a small plot on the edge of kilometer 32 of the old Rio-Sao Paulo highway, he would go there by bicycle every weekend to build their future home by himself. After construction finished, little Marco Antonio moved in with his parents and siblings. And at that time, he had his first shooting lessons with an air rifle from his father, who had served in the army as a paratrooper. With his house by the side of the highway, he was fascinated watching the columns of soldiers who often marched along that route, and many times he received rations given by the military to the children. Through these experiences, the desire to become a soldier grew in him, even in his childhood. From then on, Marco Antonio never gave up on this dream. His father, also an enthusiast of military life, kept his son in a demanding routine of physical preparation. And this ended up being the only subject that really captured Marco Antonio's attention at school. Passionate about hunting, he designed and built his own slingshots with which he hunted small animals in the woods, until his older brother received an air rifle as a gift from their father. Furious at his brother's lack of interest in the gift, he would take the air rifle whenever his brother walked away. With it, he developed advanced marksmanship skills, constantly practicing and learning independently. His reputation as an excellent marksman was already spreading among his friends. It was in this way that, not yet 18 years old, on June 30, 1982, Marco Antonio reported to the military draft board in Baixada Fluminense and returned home smiling with his enlistment document in hand. On February 3, 1983, soldier Marco Antonio was incorporated into the 25th Battalion of the legendary Parachute Infantry Brigade, based in Vila Militar, where he began serving in the support platoon of the 1st Parachute Rifleman Company. Already in the first basic shooting instruction, his remarkable accuracy caught the attention of the sergeant instructor, who then selected him to join the unit's pentathlon team. After the tower jump practice, Marco Antonio entered the cargo compartment of a de Havilland Canada 5 Buffalo for the first time. He skillfully completed the 4 qualifying jumps of his basic training. He finished the course on May 4th and was declared military parachutist number 38,327. One day while on duty in the battalion courtyard, Marco Antonio looked up. In the second-floor pavilion hallway, a curious figure caught his attention. An army officer, with his uniform impeccably neat, was leaning on the railing, and on his head wore a black cap with a skull-shaped badge. The intrigued soldier then asked his corporal about the meaning of that symbol. The corporal smiled with disdain and replied, "That's something you'll never be." Special forces are only for sergeants and officers. Unfazed by the tone of the response, Marco Antonio simply kept that name to himself, and the notion that this force should be where only the best of the best could join. The curiosity remained strong in his mind, but he didn't have to wait long to be presented with a surprising opportunity. After a graduation ceremony, a captain from the brigade's general staff announced to the troops in the courtyard that the Brazilian army was creating a new elite unit, the 1st Special Forces Battalion. And that, at that moment, they needed corporals and volunteer soldiers to join its first contingent. Marco Antonio could hardly contain his excitement. Despite the demanding requirements listed, 80 volunteers signed up to join the new battalion, and after a tough selection process carried out by the new command, only 9 soldiers were approved, among them soldier Marco Antonio. On January 23, 1984, the officers and sergeants who were already part of the Special Forces detachment began the arduous training program for their new contingent, putting the soldiers through a cycle of challenges never before seen in Brazilian military history. And after 3 months, only those who endured the trials could be called the Commando Action Troops. Soldier Marco Antonio then relied on the knowledge of Sub-Lieutenant Deus Dedith Cortez, an expert marksman. He absorbed his knowledge with a high degree of dedication, becoming a specialist in precision shooting, a person internationally recognized as a sniper, and who, within the Brazilian army, is designated as a marksman. Starting in 1987, when he was promoted to corporal for 4 consecutive years, Marco Antonio was the best shooter in the brigade, receiving several commendations in the unit's reports. And in 1988, he began to be mentored by then-Lieutenant Roberto Criscuoli, another precision shooting champion, who would go on to have a long career in the Special Forces. At a time when the doctrine of the Special Forces Battalion was still under development, the unit received a new commander, Lieutenant Colonel Alvaro Pinheiro, who would bring about a true revolution in the methods and practices of the Brazilian commandos. In early 1989, Colonel Alvaro implemented the Urban Combat Course, an urban training area that began to train Brazilian commandos in counterterrorism operations. And Marco Antonio carried out several demonstrations there for both foreign and national delegations. That year, German Heckler & Koch precision Schützengewehr, 1 rifles and 7.62 caliber arrived for evaluation. And Corporal Marco Antonio was one of the first to receive a sample for testing. In the beginning, I used to shoot with Companhia Brasileira de Cartuchos M1 ammunition, but then Finnish Lapua ammunition started to appear, which was meant for the shooting competitions I took part in. I requested authorization and began setting aside ammo to test the precision Schützengewehr. 1. I would go to the shooting range to practice various shooting. Multiple targets at various distances, incapacitation shots against terrorists, shots at the T-zone, and also shots at moving targets up to 200 meters, with a pulley device that I designed myself. Besides the battalion's shooting range, Marco Antonio also started practicing at the Jericeno training field, where he was able to make accurate shots at targets up to 600 meters away. In 1991, he got a copy of the United States Marine Corps Sniper Manual from a friend. And, despite the difficulties with English, he went through the book thoroughly and absorbed as much information as he could. The next year, Marco Antonio joined the Special Forces Operational Detachment, providing security for the ECO 92 conference in Rio de Janeiro. In 1995, he was transferred to the battalion's Counterterrorism Detachment. Starting in 1998, Marco Antonio started working as an instructor for the new classes of commandos and special forces, passing on the knowledge that many times he had developed himself. At that point in his military career, Corporal Marco Antonio could have just been known as a memorable commando instructor. But fate had a big change in store for his path as a result of events that were happening far away from there. The Caribbean Republic of Haiti is the poorest state in the Americas, and in 2000, it went through a controversial electoral process that gave victory to Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a former Catholic priest who had already been president in the early 90s, having been overthrown by a coup d'etat. Aristide took office in 2001, but at the same time, rival political factions armed a militia group that began assassinating government members throughout the country, creating growing instability that the president was unable to counter. In the following years, a virtual civil war broke out in Haiti, with several cities falling under opposition control. Until, in February 2004, the rebels took over the capital, Port-au-Prince. And on the night of February 28th, Jean-Bertrand Aristide was evacuated from the country on an American plane still under controversial circumstances. Looting and violence took over the capital, and the total disorder in the country became a regional threat recognized by the United Nations, whose Security Council approved on April 30th of that year Resolution 1542, which created the United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti, or United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti. The mission was supposed to have a large military contingent to act as a police force in the country, with the goal of restoring order in what had effectively become a war zone, where numerous gangs fought for control of Port-au-Prince, committing acts of extreme violence against the population. With the United States militarily involved in two simultaneous wars, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the task of leading the military component fell to the second largest military power on the continent, Brazil. The first Brazilian contingent arrived in Haiti in September and began stabilization actions in Port-au-Prince, achieving success in troubled districts such as Bel Air and Cité Militaire. Another troubled area, however, would remain an impregnable stronghold of armed gang groups. The coastal district of Cité Soleil, or City of the Sun, which housed 250,000 people in an environment of extreme poverty, was the stronghold of violent criminal gangs supplied with heavy weaponry who used the chaotic urban structure of the area, made up of alleys and narrow streets, to make control by the Blue Helmets impossible. Controlling crime in Cité Soleil was Ivan Stikotogen, only 21 years old, who since 2004 had been committing a series of murders and kidnappings throughout the city, terrorizing the population of Port-au-Prince. 2 Jordanian soldiers had already been killed and several others wounded at the site. And in this way, the Mission Command decided to deploy the Brazilian battalion to finally pacify Cité Soleil. On July 18, 2006, Marco Antonio, who had been promoted to 3rd Sergeant 2 years earlier, had his name included in the Peace Operations Detachment Contingent, the group of 24 commandos that would make up the 6th Brazilian contingent, known as Joru Force, which would head to Haiti in December. Already 42 years old, a veteran among the young contingent of the detachment, he reported for duty at the new Special Forces headquarters in Goiânia. I reported to the Guard Corps, showed my identification, and said I was going to join DOPAZ. They exchanged incredulous looks, and many seemed hesitant about my presence. I knew I had to do my best to earn the trust of my comrades. So I did all the training, always carrying the full gear, vest, helmet, assault backpack, canteen, ammunition, everything. I only removed the gear at lunch and bedtime. That makes all the difference. When you get to the mission, nothing bothers you. At the moment of choosing the code names to be used abroad, the commanders had no doubts Sergeant Marco Antonio would be the scary one. Arriving in Port-au-Prince on December 7th, DOPAZ was introduced to the commander of the Brazilian battalion, Special Forces Colonel Claudio Barroso Magno, who, being the most senior commander on the mission, would receive the traditional codename Kid Preto. However, to boost DOPAZ's morale, Barroso Magno gave the codename Kid Preto to the detachment commander. From that moment on, he became known as Kid Bleu, or Blue in French, a reference to the color of the United Nations. After adjusting his Remington M24 rifle in the hills north of Port-au-Prince on the 8th, 10 days later, Marco Antonio finally received the order to enter enemy territory. On the 18th, he took part in a reconnaissance of the Bois Neuf and Royard sector, northeast of Cité Soleil, controlled by the criminal Pierre Belloni, 27 years old, a known perpetrator of extortion and kidnappings throughout the city. On December 21st, a column of 3 OT-64 Scott armored vehicles from the Uruguayan force traveling in the region was ambushed by Belloni's men, and, after being attacked by machine guns and Avtomat Kalashnikova, 47 rifles the Uruguayans retreated, abandoning one of the vehicles with all its arsenal falling into the hands of the criminals, who later set the vehicle on fire. In response, Colonel Kid Blue ordered the execution of Operation Peaceful Christmas to be carried out the following day. The Special Forces would take 3 strongholds occupied by Belloni along the important route Soleil 9, with the goal of making way for the rescue of the armored vehicle. The DOPAZ Alpha team would take a position called Yellow House, while the Bravo team, which Marco Antonio was part of, would take the Evangelical School. The Brazilian Navy Amphibious Commandos team would complete the action by taking a 3rd building. DOPAZ moved out on the night of the 22nd in 2 E-11 Urutu armored vehicles, armed with mitrailleuses d'appui general machine guns, assault rifles, and anti-tank 4 rocket launchers, as well as sniper rifles. Alpha Team arrived first, despite heavy Avtomat Kalashnikova 47 fire. With difficulty, they exited the armored vehicle and tried to break down the Yellow House's heavy door with a battering ram, but failed. At the same time, the amphibious commandos came under flanking fire as they tried to break into their target. The 2nd Urutu, with the Bravo team, arrived at the scene returning fire with the turret machine gun. Standing behind him in one of the hatches was Sergeant Marco Antonio with an anti-tank, 4 launcher on his shoulder, whose night sight system had been improvised by him. The remarkable one then fired at the enemy force on the other side of the street in front of the Yellow House, silencing their position and allowing the commandos to storm the location. With the new launcher, he turned and fired a 2nd shot, this time at the position targeting the Marines, hitting the house gate directly, which came down, putting an end to the shooter's fire. Bravo team exited the Urutu, and Marco Antonio moved to a position on the 2nd floor, which faced an enemy stronghold. When he took position and examined the firing field with the scope, he noticed a large number of shooters, about 15 different targets. With quick thinking, honed by years of training, the sergeant singled out one of the shooters and pulled the trigger, silencing him forever. The action was repeated, and Marco Antonio remained firm even when the enemy discovered his position and covered the wall in front of him with fire. Amid the confusion, he was hit by friendly machine gun fire, yet still did not abandon his post. After hours of confrontation, the enemy retreated from the surroundings, allowing the buildings to be permanently occupied by the United Nations and the Uruguayan armored vehicle to be recovered. With the success of Operation Peaceful Christmas, DOPAZ's attention turned to Jamaica Base, the fortress used by Yvon Jeune to control Cité Soleil. And to begin breaking through its security perimeter, a 3-story building known as Blue House was chosen as the target, located 350 meters from Jamaica Base and providing an unobstructed view of the enemy position. The commandos attacked Blue House at 4:30 in the morning on January 24th, approaching without being seen and occupying the building without difficulty. But a few minutes later, the unusual movement was detected and a barrage of fire erupted from Jamaica Base and the surrounding buildings. Asombroso and 2 other shooters then went up to the rooftop and took shelter in the building's water tank. They took over the highest point on the battlefield, taking down targets that were firing from all sides at the Blue House. Suddenly, a rifle shot grazed a colleague's head, and instinctively, Marco Antonio grabbed a Bushnell scope from the spotter and scanned the horizon in the direction of the shot. That's when hidden behind a wall of perforated bricks. He spotted the shooter's eyes, which were soon followed by the shiny tip of his rifle. Asombroso then guided his colleague's aim, who was operating a powerful Barrett 50 caliber rifle, to a precise shot that took out the shooter, who was possibly the infamous sniper nicknamed Henri PQD, responsible for the deaths of several United Nations soldiers. The Brazilian hunters held their position at the water tower all day, having raised the Special Forces flag there. This act sparked excitement among the entire Brazilian contingent after the battle. At 8 o'clock in the morning on the 25th, the commandos received orders to withdraw, leaving the occupation of the Blue House under the care of the soldiers from the 47th Infantry Battalion of Coxim in Mato Grosso do Sul. But the enemy launched a heavy counterattack against the building. At 6:30 p.m. that day, DOPAZ was ordered back to the Blue House. Throughout that night, Sergeant Asombroso once again took position in the water tower, and from up there, with his illuminated reticle, took out June's shooters one by one, with the incredible 100% success rate, making the militiamen believe that something supernatural was acting against them. 3 days later, operating in the rear of the Jamaica base, DOPAZ set up an operation to eliminate the presence of gangs around a United Nations aid station in the center of Cité Soleil. In the early hours of January 28th, the commandos silently occupied an abandoned church near the station, and Marco Antonio positioned himself at a high window, sitting on a swing he had designed. The next morning, 2 Urutus acted as bait and passed in front of the station, drawing enemy fire, which was immediately returned by the commandos. Surrounded on all sides, the Brazilian Special Forces kept the enemy engaged throughout the day, and no militiaman was able to get closer than 100 meters to the church. Having apparently eliminated the entire contingent, they received orders to withdraw at dusk. But then, a sniper was spotted at the rear of the commandos' embarkation route. As the armored vehicles pulled up and the evacuation began, Marco Antonio held his position, ready to detect any movement from the hidden enemy. In the tense moment when the last comrade was leaving the building toward the vehicle, for a split second, he saw the sniper move his rifle and immediately took him down. At the beginning of February, Yvan June's force was surrounded in the heart of the district, confined to the blocks around the Jamaica base. And Colonel Kid Blue realized that the time for the final attack had come. Operation Jauru Sudamericana was planned, with the objective of taking the National School, a 3-story building located 150 meters north of the Jamaica base, putting the enemy stronghold within direct fire range of the Brazilian infantry. In the early hours of February 9th, DOPAZ moved toward the target in 4 Urutus, having to make a detour after finding the main route blocked. With the force spotted along the way, the commandos start taking fire, which is answered by the machine guns on the turrets of the armored vehicles. Immediately after the vehicles stopped in front of the target, Sergeant Asombroso got out with an M4 assault rifle and took down a shooter armed with an Avtomat Kalashnikova 47 on top of the school wall. While DOPAZ was advancing to take the upper floors, the Brazilian force came under the heaviest wall of fire it had ever experienced. But in a short time, they completed the takeover of the building, clearing the way for a Uruguayan team armed with a 40mm grenade launcher. The Brazilian hunters took down several enemies throughout the area, while the Uruguayans kept up a constant barrage of grenades against the strongholds of the Jamaica base, exhausting the opposing force, causing Yvan June to call for a ceasefire in the middle of that morning. At 11:30, Kid Bledel ordered the infiltration of the Jamaica base, and the Brazilian contingent advanced in Urutus, receiving cover from the hunters. Suddenly, the convoy was fired upon by a single shooter with a machine gun. Marco Antonio quickly identified the shooter 350 meters away and silenced him with one precise shot. The remarkable man's precise shot ended the action, and the Brazilian troops entered the enemy fortress where they found a large quantity of weapons, ammunition, vehicles, and other goods that were confiscated or destroyed. With the destruction of the Jamaica base, the organized resistance in Cité Soleil was dissipated, and only actions by small gangs continued in the following months, being eliminated one by the peacekeeping force. The Joru force had achieved its goal of pacifying Cité Soleil, and the tenacity of Sergeant Marco Antonio had been fundamental for that. On June 5th, 2007, his mission was completed, and he returned to Brazil. But 2 years later, he would receive a new call to return to Haiti with the 12th Contingent, on a mission that would impact his story in a very different way, landing in Port-au-Prince on January 11th, 2010. The next day, Sergeant saw Haiti shaken by a devastating magnitude 7 earthquake, which virtually demolished the capital and killed 160,000 people, including 18 Brazilian soldiers. In the chaotic aftermath of the quake, the Brazilian contingent saw its mission shift from stabilization to humanitarian aid, and numerous people were rescued by United Nations soldiers. On the 16th, while patrolling a busy street in Bel Air, Marco Antonio found a woman calling for help on top of the rubble, later identified as Mimos Jean-Baptiste, a nurse. Reassuring her, he stayed by her side for 6 hours until the rescue was completed and the victim was taken to the hospital, with the entire event being recorded by the Brazilian press. Rescue and reconstruction were the main activities of this second mission, which ended in August with their return to Brazil. The greatest Brazilian sniper returned to his role as a Special Forces instructor, retiring 3 years later on August 8, 2013. Although the official numbers regarding his total kills remain classified in Army documentation, Sergeant Marco Antonio is recognized as having by far the highest personal score among Brazilian snipers. His portrait with the inscription 0 is displayed at the Special Forces Sniper Training Center, marking his astonishing place on the podium of Brazilian military history. Did you like this video? So send us a pics or support the War Room on Apoyacy, because that way you get your reward and join our very important person WhatsApp group. I want to thank everyone who's helping, especially these comrades here who are top-notch. And if you want to buy the books I use to make these videos, their links will be right down here. For now, watch these videos I picked for you, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss notifications when I post more videos. I'll stop here and thank you again for watching. And here's a big hug from the War Room.